As much as I adore ancient Greek philosophy, I still have a bone to pick with those guys. The idea that man is a social animal. Well, first of all, what the hell does that mean? How is it essential to the species Homo sapien? Is it any less true, for example, to say that man is a thinking animal, or a teleologically oriented one, or a musically inclined one in one's leisure time? How remotely, how simplistically do you take these abstractions, and what precisely is their correspondence to aspects of reality in a way that is actually useful to us? Take the example of small talk, for instance. Hi, how are you? I'm great, I'm fantastic, how are you? Now ask yourself, in that exchange, is there anything of meaningful substance that is being vestibuled as a source of authentic, spontaneous, substantive information gathering, aside from merely any tangential, feel-good aspects that we may have a sensation or a proclivity to hang on to. What I'm trying to say is that I think the reason why people don't really seem to be communicating very well these days is because all of these questions have been hackneyed trillions of times over. So when your brain is primed to hear these traditional happenstances, some part of your brain thinks, oh, well, this is the way that it's always been done. And in order for me to fit in, to secure friend groups, to assure myself of long-term survival and reproduction, for example, a modicum of mindless conformity is, in the words of the transcendentalists, the virtue that is most in demand. Now, aside from the various levels of truth embedded implicitly in the connotations that I've just asserted, let's set that aside for a moment and think about how, if you're not a very classically socially oriented person, and I would consider myself one, how do you savor those moments in which you desire human connection? You're out, for example, at a coffee shop. That's usually what I do. Once in a while, I'll go out, play chess with a few people that I know, and quietly withdraw into my hut, because the crossfires of epistemological understanding that are balkanized via dynamic shifts in the fact that, hey, regardless of how any given person wishes to deny it, there is an aspect to each of us that is individual. You can take that from a scientific or a philosophical or a literary point of view. And I think that the whole notion of AI and the burgeoning reality thereof is a useful foil, regardless of whatever futures may be premeditated by such inventors. What I'm saying is that I think the reason why so many humans appear to be in such pain right now, at least partially, aside from the various crises which need not be named, either real or imagined, is that these dynamic aspects of game playing, and that's not meant derogatorily in this instance, by the way, in the sense that when you meet a stranger for the first time, or you meet an acquaintance for the second time, and there's that part of your brain that is sort of trying to predict how everything is going to play out, and of course the other person is doing the same, unless you do uniquely have rapport, in which I suggest you hang on to that and honor it, and be grateful in whatever ways you can. But I think this is really a time now more than ever that each person in social circumstances be somewhat willing to be strong for those who might obviously or even more subtly be having even a worse day than you are having. I think it's somewhat really in the nature of life to accept these. One component is the narcissistic tendency, the desire to do for yourself, to feed those interests which you have taken the time to identify, or to fulfill those instincts which arise automatically. See, one problem, I think, is that governments do not desire that citizens be thinking original thoughts. And yet, it has long since come to my attention that the manufacturing, if you will, that's quite a crude word, but the construction of thoughts which challenge each other, contrary to the run-of-the-mill, is precisely, I believe, what humanity needs at this moment. The brain and its allure for novelty is one aspect of a piece in your life in the jigsaw puzzle that might be missing. People have heard these questions over and over again. How are you? Now, how many times have you met someone who's asked you that question and then followed up with saying, by the way, I genuinely want to know? Usually that doesn't happen, right? So you, as a thinking, breathing, somewhat goal-oriented thing on your best days, you are essentially left to your own devices in those moments. As I would argue, we all are for all moments, regardless of extenuating circumstances, no matter how starving or privileged, banal or enlightened, misguided, or justifiably self-assured. This is why I love philosophy, because even if there is no encapsulation of capturing the answers to those questions which are fingers pointing toward the moon, of ultimate truths, it is the striving in so many ways that, at least for me, gives meaning to my life. The notion of a person who could be entirely mistaken about everything they believe regarding the world, aside from those things which they are actually successfully fulfilling, based on the mindless instantiation of a need to eat, sleep, breathe. And beyond that point, the categories that can befall human beings of vegetative states, since I'm an abstract thinker, I would put it in this way, that for every idea, concept, experience, love affair, there are iterations and resolutions in one's perception, degree, and feeling of how one's entire being holds the view of that world in one's mind, heart, body, soul, whatever you want to call it. And I don't think that psychiatric Bibles, such as the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, really do us any good. Because if you look at it very closely, those clusters and descriptions, for example, of ADHD or bipolar or any of a number of disorders which might stigmatize a person for, in the words of the DSM, unpredictable behavior. Now again, what the hell does that mean? So there's a problem with this, I believe, because the people who organized this book, psychiatrists, pharmacologists, they were looking for a way to peddle their drugs. So it was a top-down approach for descriptive phenomena regarding the human psyche. No one seems to talk about this. No one seems to question it. Everyone just seems to blink, in my experience. And I don't understand it. Although I know that some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. That the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, in my opinion, theory and all that, especially after the wake of World War II, was a perfect excuse to engineer conformity in the United States. Because what did the soldiers who returned from the war have to look forward to? They had experienced desolation, close shaves, major traumas. So how in the hell is the state going to compensate those who were drafted, or even those who went voluntarily, for their sacrifice for the greater good? Now, whether or not World War II was a just war, that's a discussion for a later day. The point I'm focusing on is there was a subset of the population who had these experiences. And these experiences inevitably isolated them from the rest of us. So when they came back to America, they needed something to live for. So what were the 1950s about? You invoke the family. You command a paradigm of thou shalt obey, because are you really going to raise children as a former soldier and have them disobey you? You're a frickin' patriot. You saved the country. Of course, the propaganda top down from the state and the federal branches and all that, of course they were going to propound a doctrine which led to the stultification of the human mind. And so I need to do more research on this, but the dots I've connected make sense in my mind. And in the 60s, of course, you had the psychedelic revolution, and the sexual revolution, and then gradually even that seemed to dissipate. And if you look back at the etymology of the word government, it means to control the mind. Now, it's not my intuitive or natural bent necessarily to boil everything down to simplicities, but this is really something I believe more people should be thinking about, if they think at all. So, I'm going to circle back, because this is a rather long colloquial presentation, and I have no feel for the attention spans out there, but then again, who am I to cater? That think about what you're doing, and recognize that however much you are hurting, there is probably someone 5 feet from you in any given arbitrary colloquial arena who might be experiencing categories of pain which your vocabulary may not even imagine. Now, this whole notion of diversity being a virtue and change is good, well, studying reason and rhetoric as a background was very helpful to me, because it gave me the lesson of never taking anything out of context. And so in this vacuous soundbite age, I think it's very important to take a step back and examine the tools that we've created. And in your next prodigal bout of lucrative small talk, make it that much bigger, that much more human by the making of eye contact, especially if you're speaking to someone who's in customer service, because they're so busy around the clock that they don't have the time to figure out who's being genuine and who's not, which essentially amounts to not being able to figure out who's human and who is not passing the Turing test. You see what I mean? I hope this gave you food for thought, and have a lovely day.